The first part of our discussion will just be a quick overview on iterators. Any class that implements the interface iterable must define the iterator method that returns an iterator object. So this is what the function signature would look like. The class that defines this iterator object would need to implement the iterator interface, and as a result would need to define the hasNext and next methods. So next would return the next element in the iterator, and hasNext would return a boolean. True if there is another element to return if we were to call the next method, and false if there are no more elements left. And just a quick clarification on terminology, we use an iterable to support the enhanced for loop, and we can define custom iterators that maintain our current state in some iterative context. In question 2, we are going to create an iterable office hours queue. To start, we have a OH request object, which represents a single request, and like an int node, it has a reference to the next request. It also has the variables description and name, which contain the description of the bug and name of the person on the queue. So first, we're going to define an iterator by defining a class OH iterator that implements an iterator over OH request objects that only returns requests with good descriptions. Our OH iterators constructor will take in an OH request object that represents the first OH request object on the queue. The provided function is good, accepts a description, and says if the description is good or not. So as we mentioned in the warm-up, an iterator class must implement the iterator interface. Since the purpose of iterators is to remember our place in a list or set of elements while iterating, our constructor should initialize cur to the OH request object passed in. Next, we need to override the hasNext method. In hasNext, we must maintain the invariant that cur will always be what we want to return inside of the next function. In other words, every time we call next, we will return the current value of cur and set cur to the value of its next variable. Since we only want to be returning requests with good descriptions, our cur pointer should reflect that. And that will be the job of hasNext, in addition to determining whether or not we have more elements to iterate over. To accomplish all of this, we will need to call the isGood method on the description of every object and increment cur accordingly. So to begin, we will have a while loop to check if our current value of cur is something we'd like to return. If not, we will iterate through the request until either cur becomes null or until we find a good element. Once we are sure cur is pointing to a desirable instance, we terminate with a final null check to detect if we are done iterating. Finally, we need to override the next method. So as mentioned before, next will return the current value of cur and increment the cur pointer. Before doing that though, we should check if there really is something to return. So if hasNext returns false, we throw an exception. Otherwise, we have a temporary variable pointing to the request we want to return, update the current pointer, and return the object. So now we're ready to define our office hours queue class. We want it to be iterable so we can process OH requests objects with good descriptions, so we need it to implement the iterable interface. Our constructor will take in an OH request object representing the first request in the queue, so we need to have a OH request variable and initialize this. And lastly, since we've implemented iterable, we need to define an iterator method that returns a new iterator object. So in our case, we just want to return a new instance of the OH iterator we just created by passing in our first request. The last part of this question asks us to fill in the main method such that we make a new office hours queue object and print the names of people with good descriptions. As we can see, these new objects are constructed such that the next variable is set to the request we defined in the previous line, with S5 being the head of our request list. So since office hours queue implements the iterable interface, we can utilize the enhanced for loop and print each request instance's name.